Hello, this is Mark Fenderson, here to share some information that may be helpful to those who are going through, particularly in the areas of relationships. What we want to talk about in this setting is the concept of soul ties. Have you ever been connected to a person and whether the interaction was positive or negative, for that matter, once the relationship ended or came to a ceasing or cessation, there was still some form of residue, for lack of a better term, that involved that person, place, or thing, particularly a person. Many times when we are connected to people, even when there is a cessation of that relationship or that friendship, there is still a lingering dynamic that occurs. And what we want to do is to talk about that just a little bit, provide some context, provide some information as to how those things are formed, and perhaps get into some of the possible solutions to deal with that dynamic. The concept of soul ties is not new. The Bible does not specifically talk about it in regards to a specific term, but we can definitely see that in the Old and New Testament, it did and it does exist. One of the things that is very interesting is to recognize what the soul is, the function of the soul, and how the soul works in concert, with the body and the mind to bring about situations and manifestations in our life. For example, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it reads, "And the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." It's interesting to note that we as individuals are different from all of the creation. We're different from the animals and the fish and the fowl. Even David points that out in the book of Psalms when he says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and have crowned him with glory and honor." It's very interesting to note that man was made to be different than all creation that has ever been on the planet. Now, the question is, what is your soul? What is the soul? The soul is considered the inner self-conscious mechanism of a man or of a woman. It is the internal quarterback that dictates how you connect with your body and your spirit. For example, your body is very earth conscious, is very sensual. We operate with the five senses based upon how our body interacts and perceives stimulus. The second thing is we have a soul, of course, which speaks to self and inner consciousness, how we respond, how we interpret, how we think, how we react to things can be connected to our soul, which many theologians attribute to the mind, the will, and also the conscience. Some call the determination or the determining factor of man. And then, of course, there is the spirit of man, that divine part that God places in all of us that responds to him and that seeks out the answers that are connected to eternity. And so what is a soul tie? We've established what the soul is in connection to the body. But what is a soul tie? A soul tie basically is a connection or a bond that unites you with another person or another group of people. Soul ties are established through the matrix of close friendships and relationships. They're also established through vows, through covenants, through promises. For example, soul ties can also be intergenerational. If your grandfather and someone else's grandfather made a decision to remain connected intergenerationally in regards to a specific concept or unifying segment of life, then that soul tie now becomes a transgenerational agreement. And that's something to also consider. And of course, lastly, one of the more common and one of the more prevalent ways that a soul tie manifests is through sexual intercourse or activity. Now, here's the thing. Soul ties are easy to form, but they're difficult to break. Everything that feels right is not necessarily right. What do you mean? All of us have emotions. All of us have feelings. And sometimes not only can your mind play tricks with you, but your emotions can as well. Everything that looks good is not necessarily good. Everything that feels good, smells good, isn't necessarily good. And this is why we need wisdom. What is wisdom? Wisdom is the ability to discern between what looks right and what is right. For there's a way that seems right to a man, a woman, a boy, or a girl, but the end thereof is death and destruction. Here's the thing that we must remember. Because feelings can lie and sometimes deceive, it is important to hear the voice of God so we can know the will of God in every situation. I've heard it said like this: it is never wise to make a permanent decision about a temporary circumstance, nor is it wise to make a temporary decision about a permanent circumstance. And so our ability to make decisions must line up with that place or that position in life where we are, because our decisions do affect our destiny. Now, we talked about soul ties, and there are good soul ties. Good soul ties, they promote purity. What do you mean? Pure motives. They promote freedom. Not the license to do whatever you want just because you're big and bad enough to do it. But it promotes the ability to operate from a spirit of liberty. For where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty. The other thing is this: it promotes trust and respect, and it promotes healing and restoration. It's very important that the people that you are connected to are adding to your life and are bringing truth and bringing positiveness instead of bringing toxicity. What will a negative soul tie do for you? It brings bondage. It brings control. It brings disobedience. What do you mean disobedience? Disobedience to the principles that we know that are right, that will bring success. It brings lust. Lust, of course, isn't just a sexual thing. Lust basically means an overindulgence in anything. It could even be a good thing. But if there is a overindulgence in something, even a good thing can become bad for you. And the other piece, it causes strife. And what is strife? Unresolved issues. It causes pain. It causes suspicion. Many of us are struggling and wrestling with the ability to bless and be blessed by others because of traumatic experiences we've experienced at the hands of others. And because of those experiences, we are not as quick to allow folks close to us that can be a blessing to us and whom we can bless as well. The other thing is that with those negative soul tie experiences comes residue. What do you mean? Have you ever seen where you attract people of the same type, and in that attraction of those people to you, all of them have a certain negative proclivity that is identical to something that someone else did previously in your life? That's because of the residue that negative soul tie can bring. What I would like to do is just to share a couple of examples of good ones and a couple examples of some not so good ones to provide some additional context to how a soul tie can affect a person's life. One good example is the tie between David, the shepherd boy, and Jonathan, the king's son. David and Jonathan had a very unique relationship. They were blood brothers. They were the best of friends. They were confidants to each other, and they believed in one another. There was not a spirit of competition between the two. There was mutual love, respect, and understanding. Now, we know the story about David being the shepherd boy that killed Goliath. Most of us are familiar with that even from our young age. But the interesting thing to note about the relationship between David and Jonathan was that David was meant to be king. And even though Jonathan was in line to be king, Jonathan, David's friend, taught him about the protocol of the kingdom. He taught him what he learned from his father. He even let him try on his kingly clothes because there was no fear in their relationship. They had a friendship where they could let their guard down, be themselves, and bless one another. It's a beautiful thing when you can be connected to a person or persons and you can be yourself and not have to worry about being judged, being maligned, that other person talking about you in a negative way, or trying to change you from who you are. Many a times people try and change folk. And whenever you try and change someone other than yourself, you create a problem that's not necessarily one that others want to deal with. Jonathan became, again, a close friend, a close confidant to David. Even though Jonathan's father, it would appear, despised David. There's something to be said about insecure leaders. An insecure leader is a tragedy waiting to happen if they don't get a grip on their insecurities. And this is the thing that Saul never got a grip on. Jonathan respected his father, but he understood that the insecurities of his father would not bring glory to God. Another example of a positive relationship or positive soul tie, I would say, would be that of Ruth and Naomi. One was a mother figure, the other was a daughter figure. And the younger married the son of the older. The son dies. They're in a tough and hard place. But the younger decides to follow the older because she understood that there was a blessing attached to the honor of this mother. And through the wisdom of this mother, she was able to come in contact with a man named Boaz. And they came together. And through that contact came the lineage through which Christ himself sprang from. And so we have a situation or an example rather, of two men that were as brothers. And then in the case of Ruth to Naomi, then there's a mother or a daughter-mother dynamic. Now, we talked about David a little earlier. We talked about how David was a shepherd boy who became king. He slew Goliath, and he became a natural, or rather a national hero in Israel. But how many of you know that even the best of us have our issues? David grew up in a dysfunctional family. How do we know this? When Saul messed up and God sent Samuel to find his replacement, Jesse brings out all his sons with the exception of David. He didn't even send for David to even be there to witness the possible pre-coronation of his brother. The other piece was David had relationship issues not only with his family, but he had a relationship issue with Saul, his future father-in-law, because his father-in-law tried to kill him. And David had to find a way to work through the trauma of being outlawed by his in-laws. Fast forward to the middle-aged years of David. His best friend is dead, Jonathan. There is no true record that his brothers ever became close to him. And the other piece, his mentor, Samuel, is dead. So now he's at a critical juncture in his life. He now has to face his future without those who he has trusted the most. Not only has that occurred, his skills, his ability to fight, they have eroded. What do you mean? David kills Goliath. David kills Goliath with one stone, but he had 5 stones. Archaeological data, historical data bears out that Saul had at least 4 more brothers who were just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than him. When David reaches middle age, the most dangerous of those brothers comes looking for him to kill him and has him, if I recall correctly, on the ground, ready to kill him when his men break through the line and kill the giant that's trying to kill their king. There's a lesson in that. Whatever you refuse to kill now will try and kill you later. It's always good for all of us, including myself, to take an inventory of our life. What do we have? But what's missing? What have we conquered? But what have we yet to conquer? Because it's very important to conquer those things that are trying to conquer us, particularly if you're a parent, because you don't want those issues to pass on to your child. As history would have it and would record, David did not overcome those issues at that time. When this particular enemy tried to kill him, they sent him home. And in sending him home, he has more time than he should have had on his hands. Most of you know the story. He sees Bathsheba on the roof. He has Joab call her in. He takes another man's wife, impregnates her, and then he tries to bring the man home to be with that woman, to cover up what he did. And the man was more honorable than David in that he would not go to his wife because he was in a time of war. And so since David could not get this young man to do his bidding, he has him sent to the front line and has him killed. And so this toxic soul tie that he has to this woman has now caused the death of her husband. And now it brings judgment because he killed a man that loved him and a man that was faithful to him. As long as David was killing the enemies of the kingdom, God did not put his hand on him because he was used as an instrument of judgment against the enemies of God and God's people. But now he kills a man that loves him. He kills a man that's faithful to him and would have given his life for him anyway. It's very important that we don't make it our business to hurt people, number one. But definitely those who are faithful and who are loving and who mean you good, don't take them for granted because they may not always be there. So David thinks he gets away. The Lord sends Nathan the prophet to him and tells him, hey, look, here's a little story about a man that had one lamb versus a man that had many. The man that had many took the lamb of the man that only had one. And the man that only had the one was sorely grieved. And I'm paraphrasing. What should be done to that man? David, being an old shepherd boy himself, says basically that man must die. Nathan says, you're the man. And of course, fear came into David's heart because David is the king. When the king issues a decree, it has to be carried out. But Nathan tells him the Lord has forgiven you and is basically forgiving you, but there will be hell in your home. It's very important that we don't rush to judgment when we see things unfold. Get all the facts before we open our mouth. Because many times we speak amiss, not knowing all the dynamics of what's presented. And so now David has created a situation that has brought into existence a child. The child is sick. The child dies. He dies on the seventh day. The child dies on the seventh day is significant because usually on the eighth day, the child is named and circumcised. But this child dies on the seventh day with what appears to be no name because he brought into existence a dynamic that didn't bring honor. And remember, a name, particularly during that time, denotes honor. What makes David any different than Saul, though? Saul, all he did, supposedly, was burn an offering and talk to a witch. David gets a woman pregnant, kills her husband, and tries to cover it up. But the difference between David and Saul, a couple of key things. Number one, David repented. Saul wouldn't. David wrote what God told him, and that's a word for someone. God is telling you something, but you're not writing it down. And you need to record what he says to you so that it's not robbed out of your consciousness, either from the enemy or from the vicissitudes of life. And the third thing was that David was more concerned ultimately about what God thought of him than what people thought of him. It's very important that we get to the point where we are more concerned about what God thinks of us than what people think of us. And so here are a couple of things to consider in this first installment of this conversation about soul ties. We have to be aware of what's toxic and what's good. We've talked about the good ones. We've talked about the toxic ones. Here are the things to be on the lookout for, a couple of them. And in our next installment, I'll get with you on the rest of them and also what we can do to overcome them. Toxic soul tie brings confusion. How can two walk together except they agree, according to Amos 3:3? With that confusion brings a warped sense of self, low self-esteem, and both of those dynamics bring with it the temptation to give up, the temptation to embrace things that you know that are not good for you, and also to resist those things that you know are good for you. The other thing is fear. Fear leads to torment. And so we must not allow fear to take over. We must cast down those fearful things and seek to take authority over those things that take authority over our mind. And another one is misery, which is simply a state of pain or distress connected to an act or a concept. These are some things that we need to look at and we need to cast off and seek to do good so that we can be successful in every area of our life. And that same success will transfer to the generations to come.